Former apartheid policeman Joao Rodrigues has died. He was charged with the murder of anti-apartheid activist Ahmed Timol. Timol died in police custody in 1971. Now, human rights lawyer and former TRC Commissioner Yasmin Sooka has been calling for justice for apartheid-era crime victims and for a commission of inquiry into why more than 300 cases that the TRC Commission handed to the NPA have still not been prosecuted. In fact, Yasmin Sooka joins us now via our video link. Yasmin, it's great to talk to you on what is a heartbreaking story in so many ways. One wonders how the family of Ahmed Timol, who really led the charge in trying to get justice for his murder, how they are feeling this morning.
Good morning, Michelle, and good morning to your listeners. It's a devastating blow for the families. As you know, Ahmed Timol appeared in 1996 before the Truth Commission, and there she made quite an impassioned plea to the Archbishop and said, find my son's killers, and let's find out why he had to be killed. And then, of course, MTS Kaji relentlessly led the charge in the period since then to really establish what happened to his uncle. He wrote his first book, there was a documentary, and already in 2003, he was in discussions with the NPA around investigating and prosecuting his uncle's killers. And at that point, you had a number of them still alive. The two key interrogators, Gloy and Van Niekerk, were alive, as was the investigating officer. But little did he know that even as he was speaking to them, they were actually lying to him. And they already knew that they were not going to investigate and prosecute because the state had placed a moratorium on dealing with these cases. And yet it was only finally when in 2016, he, together with our support, threatened the NPA with litigation, that there was a final decision that the inquest should be reopened. And of course, the rest was history. This was a historic moment in South Africa when the inquest reopened. And when Judge Billy Ramatley made his ruling overturning the suicide finding and actually saying that Ahmed Timol had been murdered by the security branch and he did not take his own life, and he recommended that Joao Rodrigues be indicted for the murder of Ahmed Timol. This was groundbreaking because it gave all the other families of victims who had died in this period such hope that finally, so many years after their loved ones had died, there would be justice. Joao Rodrigues, of course, really abused the legal system, taking it all the way up to the Concourt. And as you know, the Supreme Court of Appeals ruled that his indictment should stand, but it also said that it confirmed the full bench's finding that there be an inquiry into the political suppression by the executive and the NPA and the Hawks into why the TRC cases had not been investigated and prosecuted. And so this, of course, will now be a burning question. But there's one other issue. There were two other security branch officials implicated as aiding and abetting in the murder of Ahmed Timol. That was, this was Neville Els and Seth's sons. And Judge Billy Motley also ruled that they too should be indicted for their role. And of course, what we've been in constant touch with them about is why have there not been any indictments? And finally, yesterday, we put the NPA on terms and we said if by next week there is no action on this matter, because after all, it was 2017 when Judge Billy Motley made this ruling. We are now in September 2021. What is the legal basis for refusing to do that? Why is there such reluctance? And I think these are questions which the NPA and the state will have to answer. But you can imagine what it's like for Imtiaz and Ahmed Timol. Mohammed gave evidence last week in the reopened inquest into the death of Hussein Hafaji, and he spoke about how he had been picked up at the time when his brother had been picked up and how he too had been tortured. So, this is devastating not just for the individual family, but also for all the other families who have been waiting for justice for so many years.
Yeah.
And it's also really a betrayal of them by I'm surprised to say, the democratic state.
Absolutely. You talk about Joao Rodrigues abusing the processes. I think the number that I read was almost 30 court appearances that he initiated in trying to fight getting justice for Ahmed Timol. Yasmin, you've got a lot of experience with what the families go through in their pursuit for justice for their loved ones. What is it like for families, and this is specific to the Ahmed Timol case, for their loved one's death to be ruled a suicide when they know for a fact that was not the case?
What it inspires in them is this real desire for the truth. And in fact, if you go back right to the beginnings of when they began this quest for the truth, they were not interested in revenge. At that point, none of them were interested in a criminal prosecution. All they wanted to know was the truth. And for them, the reversal of a finding that a loved one had taken their own lives, because that is such anathema to many families that, people in detention who take their own lives, when you know that the only reason they could do that is either the state tortured them so badly that they saw no way out, or alternatively the state actually killed them, which is the case as in so many of these matters. And so for the families, every step that they win is a small victory. And the reopening of the inquest was the first victory. The second was Billy Motley overturning the ruling. The third was actually having Joao Rodrigues indicted. But that excitement dies down, and that belief in the legal system dies down when you see how perpetrators can abuse the system, and more than that, the state is actually paying all of their legal costs. And so for the families, this is devastating and absolutely heartbreaking. And that's why it makes it imperative for two things to happen. The president really has to apologize to the victims in our country. Secondly, there has to be an independent commission of inquiry to really get to the heart of why this talk of another amnesty. Is there really a secret deal? And who is implicated in that at so many different levels? And finally, of course, the only hope for the family lies with Els and Sons coming forward and actually beginning to deliver up the truth. In other countries, people go to prison for a lifetime. Not for 20 years. They spend the rest of their lives behind bars if they are implicated in what we call crimes against humanity. It has only been in our country that you have had such impunity. And this impunity has been fostered despite a very generous attempt during the transition to give them a get-out-of-jail card. Many of them have seen that as a permanent escape from ever having to give up the truth. And that's really not useful for the rule of law in our society.
I mean, it's so incredibly devastating for these families, and we can think back to so many other cases as well. The last time we spoke to you was in relation to the Craddock Four. In fact, we learned that one of the widows there had passed away again without ever having gotten justice for her husband who was killed so many years ago. I think it's over 30 years ago. You'll give us the correct timeline, Yasmin. I mean, these are people who went to the TRC and bared their souls, relived the worst time in their lives in the hope of eventually getting justice.
Absolutely. I mean, in the case of the Craddock Four, it's more than 35 years. And, last year when I chatted to Nyameka Ganwiwe, because, in 2019, she went with me to see the new head of the NPA, and we were all so hopeful that perhaps finally these cases would move. But of course, Nyameka died before anything happened. And then, of course, this year, we learned that Eric Taylor, one of the perpetrators who had not come forward and applied for amnesty in the Craddock 4 murder, he died as well. And so, the question that many victims' families are asking is this a deliberate policy on the part of the state and the NPA to wait for all the perpetrators to die before they do anything about these cases? And emotionally for the families, it means there's no closure. And what is devastating is that this struggle is now being waged not only by the mothers, the widows, but it's also being waged by the next generation. So in the case of the Craddock 4, it is the sons and the daughters of the Craddock 4 who are taking the struggle forward. In the case of Ahmed Timol, it's been Imtiaz and Mohammed. In the case of Hussein Hafiji, it's been Hussein's sister and brother. And all of them are interested in one thing. Tell us the truth about why you chose to kill our loved one, and tell us who was responsible. This is the burning question for them, this question of the truth. And under international law, we speak about the right to the truth, but also the inalienable right of victims and their families to know the truth about the fate of a loved one, to have the state investigate, to prosecute, and where evidence exists, to hold them accountable, and to ensure that reparations is made in an appropriate way. In this case, and in the case of the more than 300 cases, the state has dismally failed to honor that international obligation. But it's also about a human issue. These are human beings that we're talking about. It is about reclaiming the dignity of their loved ones, because after all, they didn't die in an empty pursuit. They died in the quest for freedom. And why should they and their families be treated with such disdain and with such disloyalty? I think that's the big question that I have. Why? Why has the state not done its job in the case, in all of these cases? It's such an indictment.
Yasmin Sooka is a human rights lawyer, former TRC commissioner. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on the AM Report. In fact, Sooka has been calling for justice for apartheid-era crime victims, for a commission of inquiry, in fact, into why those more than 300 cases the TRC commission handed to the NPA have yet to be prosecuted. Yasmin, thank you once again.